What's up, Demir Shadow lovers? Michael here again. Another Demir League. I wanted to test out a couple different cards, so I'm kind of going league by league and like making a little adjustment at a time, seeing what happens. One of the big adjustments I want to make this league was trying out Thought Scour. We've seen a lot of the blue-red mURktide lists recently, going in on Scour a little harder. And obviously, it serves them a much better purpose than it serves us. For example, they get to help turn on Delirium for Dragon's Rage Channeler, Unholy Heat, get mURktides live sooner, have another proactive cantrip for Ledger Shredder, whatever the case may be. Here, we're just using it to like help enable mURktide Regent, as well as potentially Thought Scour our opponent to turn on Drown in the Lock, or to make Drown in the Lock better. But hey, if it's got some utility, might as well give it a shot, right? So some of the changes that I made over the last list to kind of accommodate the Thought Scours is I did drop 3 of the 4 considers. I ended up keeping the 5th 1-mana cantrip, mainly because considers a little less randomness than Thought Scour. So with those 1-landers, when you really want to hit a second, considers still pretty good. And to compensate for this, I cut a Brineborn Cutthroat. I figured like I'm gonna be filling up my graveyard for mURktide more aggressively more often. So it's a little bit less necessary to have like that bridge threat, that thing that comes down before mURktide hits to help get a little bit of pressure going. Because I should just have like a bigger, more reliable mURktide if I happen to see it. And I think that's like the only thing I changed from the last league. I might have changed up like the minor misstep in the board for something. I think I changed up the second minor misstep back for a second dress down. Seeing a lot more Saga decks recently, but we'll kind of talk about that as the league goes on. Anyway, let's just jump into the matches so you can see what Thought Scour looks like, at least for the first iteration of the deck. I have no idea if Scour is going to end up being like any sort of impact card, but it's kind of free to try it out, right? Anyway, round number 1, pretty good hand. We've got Street Wraith, we've got Consider, got lands. We find a counterspell right off the bat, so decent spot to be in. We'll just kind of like hang back, hold up our interactions, see what our opponent's on. Maybe like a Wrenn and 6 deck. Nope. Invasion of Urgamon, one of the new battles from March of the Machines. So if you haven't seen this invasion yet, it's red and green, comes down with 5 defense, lets you rummage away a card and make a treasure. So really, really cool card, but by itself doesn't do anything, which is why I let it resolve. But happen to find a Thoughtseize off the top so we can see that our opponent is on like a scam list. Take a grief, counterspell a grief. Now we can drown a second grief. We still have dismember for a fury, so like we're feeling pretty good. We've got a good board presence with this mURktide out. I don't know if the invasion is like actually something that they're interested in attacking at, but at the very least they're playing Hexamage to flip it. So yeah, stuff. More invasions, cool. Not too concerned because like we're winning this race in a couple turns in the air anyway. So I just want to like play whatever I happen to have at the time, get some attacks in, put our opponent down to 1. They do have this other invasion that's kind of cool. It's 1 of every color, and you like flip cards off the top of your library until you reveal 2 non-land cards with mana value, I think 3 or less each or something like that. And you get to cast them without paying their mana cost. Well, they flipped over like a Wrenn and 6 and a Feigned Death. So 2 things that just did not matter in the slightest. Sideboarding. I boarded in, or boarded mostly like I'd board for Jund. Like took out some Street Wraiths, some Thoughtseizes, brought in Dress Downs, brought in the extra Fatal Push. EE. Just Shieldred's Edict, because I'd bring that in for scam. So I guess more for scam than I did for Jund. But again, pretty good opening hand. We've got like some counter spells. We've got threats. We've got lands. That's about all we can ask for. I don't really care about this grief because we just have double counterspell plus an edict. So even if they have like a feign death effect, we could answer it. If they have double feign death effect, then okay, you got us. But regardless, I should have played out this mURktide here. I kind of figured that because they didn't take the mURktide, they probably had an answer to it. So I didn't really want to like throw Bitter Blossom down, then have my opponent just like scam a Fury and kill the mURktide, or terminate, kill the mURktide, when I could just wait to find like a counter spell. But it turns out they just had a second grief and took it that way. So we said, all right, cool. You got us. But we do get Brineborn down. Get to start cracking in. Hopefully this Bitter Blossom sticks around for a second. It looks like they just have oodles of Fable of the Mirror Breaker. I could have cracked the Fiery Islet before the Fable, but I'm planning on like using this Dismember anyway. And if I found a counter spell, I would just hold it for the next thing, because I'd rather kill a Fury than counterspell a Fable. Or I'd rather counterspell a Fable, or rather counterspell a Fury than counterspell a Fable. So even if I drew a counterspell, I wouldn't be casting it on the Fable token, or the Fable anyway. But regardless, here, like, as long as our opponent doesn't have a Fury, we're kind of fine. And they ditched one to Fable, so all right. Match number 2, we've got Hand Disruption, we've got counter spells, we've got interaction. We're up against Hammertime. They do have a Saga in hand, which is a little rough, but we're not like completely out of it. Their 2 top decks were a 1-drop into a 2-drop, so you know, good deck building. But Answer the Stoneforge, we've got the Fatal Push to take out the Giver. We can take out one of these Saga tokens. We just need to like find a threat pretty quickly. Maybe we find, I don't know, a Shadow or a mURktide. No. Right. Land. That was my second option. So, as a couple people have pointed out in the Discord, like, Urza's Saga decks are pretty rough, and I've been seeing a lot more of them recently, so I'm kind of inclined to add the second dress down to the main, just for a little extra pop there. But ultimately, like, our opponent's got this hammer, but they don't have a way to equip it. So if I get to get down my Shadow, hold up the counterspell for the Pure Steel Paladin, then maybe I can kind of like turn the corner here. I'm kind of figuring, okay, Sigarda's Aid doesn't matter as long as they don't have another hammer. I can get a little chip shot in here, because if they attack me back, I can attack them again if they don't hit an artifact. But of course, they hit an artifact, so that stops my attacking. But maybe I can find like another threat. Technically. Just so I can keep on the offensive. Like, yeah, I have to chump block, but at least I put myself in a position where if I do find like a removal spell, or I find another piece of interaction, I can be in a really good spot. Can't attack, unfortunately. But thankfully, opponent's just drawing pretty dead. Stubborn Denial is a really great pickup. So I just need to find like a second threat or a piece of removal, and I should be okay. So find second threat. Now I can force double chump block every turn. Don't care about the Shadow Spear. Like, they gain a little bit of life, but I'm still presenting double lethal with my attackers. Unless my opponent has a Solitude off the top. Because obviously that was a card I felt I should play around this game. Spoiler alert, I didn't. Did not have Solitude on my radar at all. So we went from... I don't think we could have done anything different. Like, there's not a world where I draw that second shadow and I don't play it out. So, ultimately, I think all of my decisions were fine. Just, like, unfortunate that I ran into a Hammertime deck with Solitude. With Archmage's Charm, I can steal a threat. Since I move this Shadow Spear to the Ornithopter, I can just, like, steal the Ornithopter in combat. At the very least, gives me like a free chump blocker and gain a life. Ooh. But ultimately, if I don't find like more threats, I'm pretty dead. Dismember buys me a turn. So that's got to count for something. And then I'm dead. All right, game number 2. So Solitude absolutely wrecked our world there. Shocker. But it was more the fact that I wasn't about to play around Solitude. If I had like a removal spell in hand at any point, then maybe, but no removal spell and not expecting a card. I'm not playing around it. Game number 2, we've got to drown in Archmage's Charm. It's a pretty weak hand overall. I kind of figure if my opponent like does end up throwing a threat and a hammer at me, then maybe I just like Archmage's Charm, steal the threat afterwards. But I do at least get to like Thought Scour my opponent to turn on Drown in the Lock. So I've got that live. And now with double Archmage's Charm, like I'm not feeling awful. I do think there was a bit of a misplay here. I should have just taken this Sigarda's Aid, but I ended up drawing 2 instead. But if I'd taken the Aid, I wouldn't be afraid of like them getting a hammer off this Urza Saga. I kind of figured like, oh, I've got all these cards. Like, why should I be afraid of something here? When realistically, like, I could have played around them having stuff. That being said, I took the token so that hopefully I'd be able to just like chump block anything that they got out. Like they could Ginger Brute, but they would have to have Ginger Brute, double hammer in hand to be able to beat my blocker plus Dismember. And I figured the odds were like pretty low of that. And if they got anything besides Ginger Brute, I'd be able to chump block. But then they Solitude the blocker, and sure enough, Surge of Salvation and double hammer. So just kind of like full layout of things that I could have beaten. A, if I had just stolen the Sigarda's Aid, which was the biggest mistake out of all that. And B, if I hadn't have like Archmage's Charmed on my turn, then I could have just Shieldred's Edicted on their turn and had up Drown in the Lock. But anyway, match number 3, Thoughtseize, we see we're up against like one of these Dice Factory Tron decks. They've got a hand with a whole lot of mana capabilities. They don't have a payoff at the moment outside of this saga, but unfortunately, like, now double saga is probably just enough. It's like you make enough 5/5s and eventually they're going to get there, right? Do get to show off the fun sequencing of Thought Scour into Stubborn Denial to get my Brineborn Cutthroat Ferocious. We could steal something with Archmage's Charm. Probably going to try to steal the next token. Like, I don't think stealing any of the artifacts really does much for me. I could steal, like, the cornucopia, have a bunch of extra mana, but at the same time, my opponent still just has Urza's Saga, so I don't think stealing that does a whole lot for me. Steal a token just to try to keep them from having a crazy board presence. So, nope, draw. So I think this was one of those, like, play to not lose first play to win situations. Like, if I steal the token, it doesn't really matter, right? Like, they're just going to make 2 more, like, 7/7s. And me having a 1/1 doesn't affect that board in the slightest. So I decided to draw to hopefully find, like, fatal pushes and drown in the locks and stuff. But instead, just find a Shadow and a mURktide, which are actually too small to fight over those construct tokens. Sideboarding, taking out a bunch of, like, fatal pushes, dismembers, things like that. Like, yeah, they fight over tokens, but I'm bringing in Spreading Seas and Dress Down, and those fight over tokens even better. Spreading Seas just takes out Saga, strip mines it, and you draw a card. I should have just played out the Shadow that turn. Like, realistically, what are they going to do to the Shadow? I don't think they run Walking Ballista. They could have Dismember, but I think it's kind of worth the risk there to get an attack a turn sooner. Magistrate Scepter. I have no idea what that does outside of take an extra turn, but it says charge counters, so I'm going to counter it. Get it? Charge counter. It told me to do it. All right, so they do get to Blast Zone our Shadow, but thankfully we're able to find a mURktide on our next draw step, get that down, have Counterspell up. We know they've got a Karn the Great Creator, but they don't have, like, any functional mana here, so we get to go to game 3. Nice. Game 3 on the draw. Reasonable hand. Like, we've got the Stub and the Scour. We find a Thoughtseize. We've got Counterspell. Brazen Borrower can be used to kind of slow them down a little bit. Their mana is really awkward here. So I'm kind of thinking if I just, like, petty theft the cornucopia. I do want to point out mana production here. So I know they have a Mystic Forge. So I can counterspell the Mystic Forge if they end up going for it. But they also just don't have the mana to play it. So, like, even if they top deck a land, let's double check that before I say anything. If they top deck a land, they pay 1, Surge Node, put a counter on the Cornucopia. Pay 1 or pay 2 for the Cornucopia. Oh, so they could. Yeah, they could pay 1, put a counter from Surge Node on the Cornucopia, tap Cornucopia for 2, use the second land to Manifold Key to untap the Cornucopia, and tap it again to make 4. So holding up Counterspell was right. But in the turn, I'm definitely, like, petty thefting this Cornucopia to reset them. So now I can just counterspell the Cornucopia on the way back down, and hopefully that, like, stops a lot of their mana production. And then we'll stub the Power Conduit because I don't want them untapping and finding, like, an Urza's Saga. You know, an Urza's Saga. And another Power Conduit. So, little rough there. I thought about thought scouring myself to try to find a Shadow or a mURktide or, like, a really good threat. But I kind of figured if I whiffed and I was doing absolutely nothing, that was horrible for me. So I decided to just hold up the Scour and flash in the Brazen Borrower instead. Now we're actually going to see everybody's favorite play of Odawaring a Urza's Saga, just to try to slow my opponent back down by a turn. Like, I'm not doing anything. They're doing some stuff. I can EE on 1 to take out the Manifold Keys and the Surge nodes and just, like, hold up the Archmage's Charm. So I'm just trying to do, like, whatever I can to slow my opponent down just a little bit. Draw, so maybe I can find something to provide a little more pressure, like, I don't know, strip mine my opponent with a Spreading Seas. Like, realistically, the draw 2 I think is fine. I've got a lot of good draws. A Shadow, a mURktide, a Spreading Seas like that, a Dress Down, all very, very live. So my opponent gets a Magistrate Scepter down, which is fine because they can't get the charge counters on it fast enough to take the extra turn. Even if they did, I had the Stubborn Denial. So good job, Dimir Shadow. Pat on the back. Round number 4. On the play. Good proactive hand. Street Wraith, Scour, mURktide, Shadow. Street Wraith into Marsh Flat, so I have no idea what I'm up against. All I know is I want to find lands and spells and stuff. I could play out the Shadow here, but I was kind of afraid of Lightning Bolt, so I figured I'd just play like a 4/4 mURktide. A lot of decks that are running this sort of composition, like Street Wraith and Fetch lands, don't really have a lot of ways to deal with a mURktide. And if I can get that down and then just like hold up Counterspell from then out, then maybe I'll be okay. Main deck Aether Spellbomb is pretty rough. I could have counterspelled it, but I figured like I've got the Cutthroat, I've got the Shadow. So I'm not like that upset if my opponent spins the Spellbomb bouncing the mURktide when I just have backup threats. Alright, so they're just like an Asmo food deck, which Aether Spellbomb should have given that away. Alright, Phyrexian Vindicator. If you haven't seen this card, it's a 4 white for I think like a 4/5 or something, and maybe a 5/5. All right, it's a 5/5 flyer. It says if damage would be dealt to it, you prevent that damage, and then it deals that much damage to anything that you want it to deal the damage to. So really, really good threat against like the mURktide decks, against Is It mURktide? Because for the most part, once it hits the board, they can't Unholy Heat it. They can't attack into it because it just prevents the damage and like shoots something for a bunch. Not so great against us because we just have like Fatal Pushes and Drown in the Locks and things that don't actually deal damage. But either way, we just get to untap with like a Lethal Shadow and Brineborn Cutthroat, so cool. Yay, Cutthroat. Sideboarding against the... So, I do have to say, I think my sideboarding going into game 2 was pretty bad. I ended up, like, not bringing in the Dress Downs. I only brought in 1 Spreading Seas. Because I saw that Phyrexian Vindicator, I kind of assumed, like, oh, they're not on Urza's Saga. Like, why would you be on a colorless producing land with a 4 white card in your deck? Just, like, didn't seem right to me. Because if they're on Ledger Shredder and Asmo, which they got to be on Asmo because they're running Cookbook, right? then I would expect some number of Watery Graves in the deck. So now you've got Watery Grave and Urza's Saga in a deck with a 4 white pip card. And it's like, it can't be a Saga deck. Spoiler alert, it is in fact a Saga deck. Opening 7, no lands. 6, we've got Interaction, we've got Bitter Blossom. We see the Watery Grave of choice here into the Urza's Saga. So literally Watery Grave Urza's Saga in the Phyrexian Vindicator deck, which you can see one in the graveyard now. So I'm just like beyond lost on my opponent's mana situation. But at the same time, hey, they've got an Urza's Saga, and I still am going to have trouble against that. I figure they'll make another token here so I can kind of wait for that to steal one. Oh, Chromatic Star. Yes, now it's all coming together. Now I know how they're able to get away with Phyrexian Vindicator. All right. Fun little line. I attack in with my 1/1 construct. So when they go to try to just eat it with their construct, I get to steal their Shadow Spear, shrink their construct to a 2/2, grow mine to a 2/2. So we trade off constructs, but I get the Shadow Spear with like the Bitter Blossom and the tokens and stuff. Hoping for no Phyrexian Crusader. Luckily, we get to dodge that. Unfortunately, we do not dodge Ledger Shredder into Asmo into a second Urza Saga. So feeling pretty behind here, especially when our Thought Scours just start like ripping lands. Like that progression is probably not going to win you many games of Magic. When you just go scour into land, scour into land, scour into card you can't cast. Kind of expecting a Vindicator. Yep. We've got Drown in the Loch, so like we can answer the Vindicator. They're not ditching cards aggressively to these cookbooks, so if they're not doing that, it feels a little bit better for me. mURktide's Dees. I should have waited on this mURktide. I should have not cast the mURktide out this turn and waited until next turn. And the entire reason is because I know my opponent has got Aether Spellbomb in their deck. We saw it game 1. So I should have made them get something else off of this saga. I don't know what else they would have gotten, but I should have made them get something else so that the next turn I could play out mURktide, strap it up with the Shadow Spear. But because we preemptively played out a mURktide, shocker, opponent got their Aether Spellbomb. And Spreading Seas just a turn too late. Which I also could have like cracked the Fiery Islet and drawn the Spreading Seas and Spreading Seas the Urza Saga. If I hadn't played the mURktide. But, you know, we did. So just all around like poor planning on my part, those turns. I just need them to not find a, what's it called here? I also don't like this block. I think I should have quadruple blocked the Asmo to play around them having like a removal spell. And then, no, that would have killed me. Never mind. I was going to say, like, I probably should triple block the Asmo, single block Triple block the Asmo, single block the Construct. Yeah, triple Asmo, single Construct, single Ledger Shredder. And just like said, I don't think you have a removal spell. This, I definitely took the play to not lose line instead of the play to win. The play to win line is to get the Asmo off the board. And next turn, get down a mURktide, strap it up with a Shadow Spear, and go to town. This chump block is just like, I want to take less damage. Doesn't really accomplish anything. But I mean, it all kind of hinges on my opponent not finding an Oval Chase Daredevil. Which I also should have thought seized here. I don't think it really matters, but that Metallic Rebuke means I can't strap up the what's it called? Can't strap up the Shadow Spear, and they can get the extra artifacts in the yard. I didn't even notice the Salvage Titan, so that's on me. But game 3, I board in like the extra Spreading Seas, the extra Dress Downs. We're just going to try to get stuff in our yard, get our threats down, hope our opponent Urza's Sagas. Thank you very much. Asmo's a little unfortunate. I was kind of surprised that they just jammed the Asmo into like me representing Counterspell and Drown in the Lock. But it probably means they have a second Asmo in hand. But with like Asmo, double Cookbook, and a Daredevil, there's really not a lot I can do this game. Like, step number 1 is I have to find an answer to Asmo. Okay. Step number 2 is I have to hope my opponent taps off of a Metallic Rebuke, but I kind of have to just go for it. And then I also have to hope my opponent doesn't have another copy of Asmo. And it's just like a lot going on. But for the most part, we're just trying to like create some sort of a situation where I can get down my threats on a clear board with nothing crazy going on. Which is all I'm trying to set up here is like, let me get Asmo off the board, go to my main phase, get down threats, maybe find a counter spell. I don't know. Feeling crazy like that. EE to take out a bunch of food, and if they find an Asmo, I get to take out that too. Fatal Push. Yuck. All right, so they've got the Daredevil in hand and one unknown. They're just going to hard cast the Daredevil, which is fine. We'll just take the opportunity to like wipe out all the food. Now we get mURktide plus Stubborn Denial. Like, that's got to be pretty decent. It's not perfect, but we can at least stand in front of a Daredevil. We can counterspell anything too crazy. We know they can make a couple construct tokens and get an Archmage's Charm, but now that I've, or not an Archmage's Charm, Aether Spellbomb. But now that I've got Dismember, I can take out the construct tokens as well as take out the Daredevil. Counterspell's a good pickup. The aforementioned Aether Spellbomb. So at the very least, like, I will be able to replay the mURktide after they bounce it. Give them an opportunity to chump block instead of like cracking spell bomb or anything. But all right. So mURktide plus counterspell against open board. Hopefully this is enough to find a way to get there. I have to counterspell the Vindicator. What a great follow-up for them. So they can like Emery back the Aether Spell Bomb, but I do have Stubborn and all, so I'm just like, all right, you've got an Oval Chase Daredevil in hand, an unknown. You're drawing for turn. You have to chump block the Shadow. So if you find a flyer, you live. If you find a way to deal with the mURktide, you live. And if you don't do anything too crazy, then you can't gain enough life to survive. But they cookbook back the Asmo because they find the land. And now I have to deal with Asmo shooting down my mURktide. So I can top deck another mURktide, but I can't grow the current mURktide big enough to survive that. Obviously, if I had drawn another mURktide off that Consider, that would have been different. But at the end of the day, like, they have to spend some food to shoot the mURktide, which means I get down another Shadow, and I'm on double chump block duty. Oval Chase Daredevil doesn't matter. Second Emery does. So, again, they've just drawn, like, one more threat than I could deal with. It was kind of a really unfortunate like series of draws because I feel like there's a lot of stuff they could draw that's really dead, and they just happen to draw like another on curve creature, like something that they could play out this turn to double block. There's another Daredevil. So infinite chump blockers achieved. Hit a land. We dead. We dead. On to match 5. I think if I had boarded more correctly, game 2, we would have had a better chance, but I didn't because I wasn't expecting Urza Saga, and that bit me really bad. But game 3, on the draw, opponent's on mURktide. Obviously, turn 1 Ragavan, really rough for us to see. See, they have a second Ragavan. Rest of their hand's not great. Like, they've got a Channeler, they've got a Heat. But maybe if they don't draw anything relevant, we can, like, steal the Channeler. Then who knows? Maybe we can find some way to get out of this. But for the most part, Dimir really, really struggles against turn 1 Ragavan. And especially being on the draw with, like, no Drown in the Lock, no Fatal Push. You're kind of SOL. I would not fault anybody for having the mindset of if you're on the draw, mulligan aggressively for Fatal Push. Because, like, the way you're going to lose on the draw more often than not is your opponent dropping down a 1-drop that impacts the game, like Ragavan. In the blind. If you know the matchup, then I would definitely say, like, Fatal Push or Dismember on turn 1. But in the blind, I wouldn't fault you for mulling to a 1-mana interactive spell. There's a reason that, like, in my older builds, I was on 4 Fatal Push, a Blood Chief's Thirst, and, like, 2 Dismember, because I just wanted to make sure that I saw a 1-mana piece of interaction as often as I possibly could. And it's because of 2 creatures over. The little artifact-looking dude over there, yeah. Helm. Also, for whatever reason, MTGO got, like, extraordinarily laggy during this match, so it's going to, like, slow down a bit from here and there. Could play out the mURktide, but it's only a 5/5, and I know, or a 6/6, and I know they have an Unholy Heat, So as we go to Archmage's Charm, the Darcy, they've got a Spell Pierce, scoop it up. We're too far behind at this point. Sideboarding, board out all the Wraiths, keep in a couple Thought Seizes, board in like the Minor Misstep, the Shieldred's Edicts. I think 1 EE. Hoping Scour can kind of fill our yard a little bit. Come on. I have to like manually fast forward this. No. All right. Scour does flip over a mURktide, but does find our second land, which is probably more important for us right now. We've got answers to like pretty much any threat that they can play out. We would just really like to find one more land so we can start holding up like Archmage's Charm and being able to double spell. So got there. Nice. All right. So this is kind of like, I don't want to say comfort mode, but really good position. We've got counter spells, we've got backup counter spells, we've got removal spells, regardless of how big the creature is. We can back up our removal spells with counter spells. So, decent position to be in. So we'll just pick fights over stuff. Since they waited until turn 3 to Shredder, I'm assuming they've got a 1-mana interactive spell to back up the Shredder, which is why I decided to fight over it on the stack instead of letting it resolve and going for like a Fatal Push or something. I figure if they've got a mURktide to follow it up next turn, I'd rather get value out of the drown now than wait around for it to be dead. Us finding mURktide's pretty decent. I probably should just play out the mURktide here since I have the Stubborn Denial. And my opponent doesn't have Delirium, so they'd have to have like Bobble, Unholy Heat, but they didn't play a Bobble last turn. Or Expressive Iteration. But I could like let the iteration resolve and Stubborn Denial the Unholy Heat. But either way, we get to start getting some more value out of some of our cards. Like we can try to Archmage's Charm this Dragon's Rage Channeler here, and if they fight over that, then we get to untap and like Fatal Push and mURktide. Just get like a really, really big mURktide down. So as expected, they fight over that. Best draw would be another land, so we could push the Channeler, play the mURktide, hold up the Stubborn Denial. I guess we'll take a Thought Scour. But I figure an 8/8 mURktide with our opponent not having Delirium is kind of safe. Otawara is a little unfortunate, but you know, we've got these Thought Scours to help refill our yard. Otawara is like really, really solid every time I see it, whether it's against me or for me or whatever. So the double Thought Scour actually lets us completely refill for mURktide. Get all the way back up to 5 instants and sorceries in the yard. So we get to just replay that 8/8 mURktide. Opponent does have Delirium now. And it really sucks that they had the second threat. Like, I saw him exile the Ragavan. I was going to be like, okay, that's Ragavan's fine. But then they had the mURktide as well. So now Shieldred's Edict looks really bad. Not really a lot we can do here. Neither of us can play a second mURktide to grow the first one. So that's kind of a plus. Opponent decides that they want to offer up the mURktide trade. I decide to go for the Shieldred's Edict to see what they'll sacrifice. Because if they sack the rag, I might just take the mURktide trade. If they don't sack the rag, then we'll just kind of see what happens. But I decided to just let them hit me since I can play out Shadow, play out a second mURktide to grow the first mURktide, and then I just have like a good board presence. And even if my opponent top decks a mURktide, they can't outgrow my first mURktide. So I feel like I might be in an okay spot. Kind of. I don't really have an attack here because unfortunately if my opponent does find an answer to my 5/5 mURktide, I just die on the spot. And that feels pretty bad. I could have played out the Bitter Blossom, but wanted to play the Shadow so that if my opponent doesn't draw anything relevant, I can attack with the Shadow and the mURktide next turn if I find a way to lower my life and like force the chump block. Which I believe we find a Thought Scour. See if I'm right. Aha. So, scour myself. Eventually. Find a fetch land. Nice. So now I can attack with the Shadow and the mURktide. Two thoughts here. One, my opponent's got a card in hand that they have had for a few turns now. They didn't fight when I Shieldred's Edicted them. And I could have traded off mURktides. It feels like a lightning bolt because they haven't had a good target for it. Doesn't do anything to my mURktide or my Shadow. And then when they went and like snapped off this block on the Shadow, it kind of felt like, oh, they want me to block and fetch and shock to eat the mURktide, and then they just bolt me for lethal. So instead of taking that route, I just fetch, no shock, grow the Shadow to 8, trade off with the mURktide, hit them for 10, and just say, like, I'll take my 2 mURktides on board. So even if you play a mURktide, it's on chump block duty for my 10/10. Be interesting to see if they did have the lightning bolt and that read was correct. But either way, on to game 3. We do have a solid hand with some cantrips. We've got interaction. We've got a threat. Scour can start filling the yard pretty aggressively. Opponent on a mold of 6 doesn't have a turn 1 Ragavan. Obviously, very nice for me. I can just lead with the basic island since I'm holding up Thought Scour on myself as well as Dismember for a threat. And who knows, maybe they play out a threat because they think that I don't have the ability to interact with it. Like, it'd be pretty great if my opponent just spent their turn, like, dashing a Ragavan. And I got to dismember it, untap, find a black source or something like that. Nice. So go for the dash monkey. We go for the dash member. And if we can untap and find like a black source for Drown in the Loch, we're kind of cruising, right? As soon as monkey decides it doesn't want to dash anymore. You know what's not dashing is Magic Online at the moment. It's not dashing at all. Come on, Black Source. Fetchland, Watery Grave. Hey, cool. So now we can hold up Drown in the Lock, as well as if our opponent doesn't do anything crazy, we can like fetch shock, scour ourselves, consider. Usually if you're looking at like sequencing, if you've got double cantrip like this, I would lead on the Thought Scour because it's going to give you the best idea of what you're digging for with consider. If you lead on the consider, you have a better chance of finding something specific, but you don't have all the known information as to whether or not you are looking for a specific item. So Scour just gives you a little extra information to help figure out what you're looking for. Like if I Thought Scour myself and I flip over 2 spells before I consider, well, then it kind of becomes, well, I want Stubborn Denial, because Stubborn Denial with like a mURktide is going to be one of my best avenues of getting there from here. But I don't know that's what I'm looking for if I don't scour over 2 threats or 2 spells. But anyway, here's Wonderwall. Let's pass the turn, hold up Counterspell and Stubborn Denial and Petty Theft. I'm planning on just like petty thefting if my opponent doesn't do anything crazy. But I don't really want to let a Dragon's Rage Channeler resolve. I figure if they do follow this up with like a mURktide, then I can just petty theft the mURktide, so it's not the end of the world. But you can like see how laggy the client's being, right? It's just... All right. So now we can get down a mURktide and hold up a counterspell to protect the mURktide. While we're waiting on Magic Online to get its act together and move a little more smoothly, if you are not subscribed to the YouTube channel, consider hitting the subscription button or subscribe button, whatever the case may be, so that you can be up to date on content like this. Back to the aforementioned broadcast. We do get down on mURktide. They did have Counterspell. We did have Counterspell for their Counterspell. So we've got the bigger mURktide. That's the only thing that matters here. It's not the size of the murk. It's the motion of the ocean. And the motion of the ocean says we get to petty theft your mURktide. But I do want to make sure I attack first, because if my opponent gives me like a free blocker with their mURktide and tries like Bolt Mine or something, then that's a way better trade-off for me than just like petty thefting this. Then I get to save my petty theft for the next thing that would bug me. So, onward, comrades, to arms. Eventually. Hiya. Turn sideways, my loyal Sky Dragon. Opponent sees straight through our bluff and says, you know what, I'm not blocking. We say, you know what, that's fair. But we're still going to bounce your mURktide because you're like a ways off of recasting it. Hopefully by that point, especially if you have to fetch, then we might just be presenting lethal. I've got a secondary threat in Shadow. All the pieces are coming together. So, petty theft the mURktide, hold up Drown in the Lock. Hopefully we can fight over anything crazy. Got the Ragavan and the Spell Pierce. Okay. Okay. Need Ragavan to be nice to us. Bitter Blossom. That's fine. Because, like, our opponent likely can't cast it. And even if they could, if they had, like, basic land, play Bitter Blossom, Then we hit them for 8, and they're just on a 2-turn clock to their own Bitter Blossom. So realistically, not a whole lot they could hit there that we care about. If they had the land, then Shieldred's Edict could be pretty awkward. But we would just have like the follow-up Shadow, so that's not the end of the world. But either way, we're going to hit our opponent down to 2, play out our Shadow, hold up Archmage's Charm, hold up Stubborn Denial, and opponent decides they've had enough of our shenanigans and they would like to do other things. So, thoughts, Scours. I thought Scour was pretty reasonable. I think there were some times that I misboarded, like against the Asmo food deck, because I didn't think there was any way that they were possibly on Urza's Saga, and I was extraordinarily wrong. So I think I would have had a better chance game 2 if I'd brought in more of my answers to that. Otherwise, main deck felt decent. I think there's a chance, and we've tried it before on stream, where I've splashed like a Hallowed Fountain for some of the white hate pieces, like Teferi Time Reveler, Disenchant, Prismatic Ending, stuff like that. And I might be kind of inclined to do that again because I've seen a ridiculous uptick in Urza Saga decks recently. And obviously, like a dress down or 2 is nice, but not nearly enough to compete if you just run into like 3 or 4 Saga decks in a league. So I wouldn't mind having like another piece or 2 of dedicated Saga hate in the board. And if that comes in the form of like 1 Hallowed Fountain over the Fiery Islet or something, and a couple disenchants in the board, or 2 Teferis, 2 disenchant, whatever the case may be, then I think that's perfectly reasonable. Shieldred's Edict, it's like good against Scam, and I feel like that's the only deck that it's actively good against. So I'm pretty inclined to kind of cut back on those. I might keep 1 around, but I don't think I want the second. Same thing with Bitter Blossom. It's solid when you see it. Like we saw it round 2 or something, and it looked really good. It's really good in the matchups that you want it in, but it's just not like an overwhelmingly powerful card. So the second Shieldred's Edict and the second Bitter Blossom could easily become like 2 of my white Saga hate pieces. And then maybe I find room with like the second Spreading Seas or the Minor Misstep or something to go like 2 Teferi, 2 Disenchant. Or I'm sure there's some other white artifact or enchantment hate piece that might be better, but Disenchant's always classic. And then, like I said, the Fiery Islet to a Hallowed Fountain's pretty easy swap. I don't think you really want to swap out a Watery Grave because we do have a whole bunch of like double black things with the Dismembers, the Street Wraith, holding up double Drown, Drown plus Push, Thoughtseize plus Shadow, all that sort of stuff. So like having enough black sources is pretty important. But those are just some thoughts. If you decide to try out Thought Scour yourself, let me know how it goes because I'm curious to hear. I thought it was reasonable here. Yeah, we'll be trying it more in the future. Hope y'all have an awesome rest of your day. Stay safe. Enjoy some good food and company. Catch you back live later. I have the link to the stream below in case you want to catch a live stream. And yeah, that's it. Adios for now.